Okay, so if you're a guest, welcome. We're thrilled with the chance to worship with you. I'm excited to unpack the word and not sound like Luke Skywalker. Really, last week we started this series, and I woke up with a cold this morning, so if it sounds like my voice is even lower, it is. Really, we started this series last week that we're calling What Was Jesus' Creed? And if you weren't here last week, I'd love to have your feedback on last week, by the way, if you were. We had our friend Dr. Bruner here last week who backed up the dump truck, and just dumped out heapings and heapings and heapings on Christology. So I'm curious whether or not you enjoyed that or hated that. I loved it, partially because I understand that at one point in my life I paid like $200 for that lecture when I was in college, and you got it for free. So give us your feedback on that, because he's a guy who would, he's a friend, and he would love to, this could be one of our traditions where we just make a habit of bringing him here once a year. But if you're like, snooze fest, then I want to know that. But I want to jump into the Jesus Creed, so let me pray. God, squeaky. Lord, thank you. I pray that this Sunday wouldn't just be another Sunday. I pray in the monotony of weeks and Sundays and to-do lists, that you somehow protect our hearts from that. And that this morning would be transforming no matter where we're at on our spiritual journey, that it'd be helpful as we think about you. And in particular, Lord, as we try to boil things down and simplify them and really ask, what was your creed? What did you care about? What defines the win for you? The trouble with this morning, Lord, is it's all familiar, and yet we need you to awaken our hearts. Amen. Okay, so I want to start. I feel like I'm starting this series. I'm not starting this series, but here's kind of the motivation behind lots of this. Is one of the things that's occurred to me in preparation for this conversation that's going to take us through November, and in particular this week itself, is the reality that following Jesus, it follows a pretty predictable cycle. Like if you've ever engaged Jesus, if you've ever begun a relationship with Jesus, if you've even ever considered a relationship with Jesus, then very quickly what I want to point out to you is that there's a very predictable, foreseeable pattern that follows. It happens both to us as individuals, and sometimes this pattern is cyclical, like it'll go through our lives several times, and each of us is at some different spot in this pattern. And it doesn't just happen to individuals, it also happens to organizations, to groups of people. Like when people get together and say, let's follow Jesus together, let's serve Jesus together, it also happens to them. And that became all the more apparent to me as I spent Monday and Tuesday in some meetings with some churches from our conference, just to see the different places where people are at and recognizing that churches themselves follow this very same cycle, this very same pattern. Enter the Christmas tree. I know it's a little early. I actually was wishing that it was August because I thought it would be hilarious because it so fits our illustration. And now I can't remember. Oh yeah, there they are. It's early. But initially in our pursuit of Jesus, we're gripped by some ideas. Like ideas like grace. It's simple. It's far from complex. It's just like this is amazing. You mean I don't have to earn this? Words like unconditional love. Sorry, this might take me longer than I thought it was going to. And I might run out of bulb. Should have had someone else do this. Like in the early stages, there's grace, there's unconditional love, there's forgiveness. Like perhaps a relationship came to an end, perhaps you made a terrible decision, and perhaps that's when things between you and Jesus really began. Because as much of life bore out the necessary consequences, and even as God, who doesn't necessarily protect us from consequences, the message of like, yep, dumb, that was painful. And yet you're mine. Purpose. For some of us, I think our relationship with Jesus begins at this place where we've tried it all. We thought business would make us happy. We thought athletics would make us happy. We thought a 6x elk would make us happy. And we reach this point maybe in our teens, maybe in our 20s. Maybe we won the championship. And there's this like, still not happy. Perhaps you were raised religiously. And what gripped you was this simple, beautiful message about relationship. like, wait a minute, it's not about the water, it's not about the bread, it's not about stand up, sit down, fight, like it's not about any of that stuff. It's about a God who wants relationship. Maybe you just got sick of yourself and the message of service gripped you. Like this message of like you became aware of your own self-centeredness, your own egotism, and recognized God wanted to save you from that. My point is this, that when we're initially provoked by the gospel and by Jesus, it's very simple. And oftentimes, like it's the simplicity that is beautiful. And in fact, there was a point in your life where if someone would have said like, what is it about? You'd have been like, oh man, it's just grace. It's just unconditional love. It's just purpose. But where this natural cycle that I really want to kind of press in on this morning, where this really comes into effect, is it moves. It moves from this simple story and we start adding stuff to it. We start adding heaps and heaps and heaps of stuff. And before long, the simple message, captivating, beautiful, provoking, simple, it gets lost. You guys can come decorate. So they're going to do some stuff over there. Right, like first thing we do oftentimes is we add the Bible. Now, I'm a big fan of the Bible. I love the Bible. But we start adding stuff. We start talking about quiet times and Bible studies and verse memorization. And we start talking about reading books about the Bible and going to classes where they study the Bible. And we start talking about Bible school and seminary. And it's Bible. And then we start talking about verse memorization. And this whole level of holiness comes when you start memorizing verses. And then we start adding prayer. And again, prayer it's awesome, it's amazing, and yet we start talking about prayer in these very shameful ways, like how much do you pray and how often do you pray and who do you pray for, and do you just pray for yourself, or do you listen to God, or do you just lift people up to God? I mean, are you asking God to do things that he otherwise wouldn't do? Are you just submitting yourself to him? Are you praying with people? Are you praying before church? Are you praying after church? Are you praying during church? We start introducing prayer to the situation, and then there's stuff like baptism and communion, and then going to church. And then going to church becomes about like more than just going to church. It becomes like going to church at 6 a.m., right? And then it's not like just going to church at 6 a.m. Then it becomes like not leaving church till 1:30 p.m. And then we start talking about church, and it's like, and we want you to move and a long ways away from home. And then we start talking about giving. It's like, well, you got to give. And then we start talking about, okay, well, you got to give. Why do you have to give? And then it's like, you got to give to the local church. And then we start talking about, like, you got to give to Africa, and you got to give to clean water, and you got to give to AIDS. You got to give to the poor in your city, and you got to give to the poor nationally. And we start having these conversations about, well, are you saving? We start talking about money, and it just starts heaping and growing and growing and growing, and we just keep adding stuff and adding stuff and adding stuff. Church, like it started on Sunday, but then we start talking about community, and then it's like we got to go to small groups, because if you love Jesus, you have a small group that you could call them at 2 a.m. in the morning. If you don't have anybody to call at 2 a.m. in the morning, then you don't really love Jesus, so that's a problem. So you start developing a small group, right? And you go to the small group on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday you go to your accountability group, and on Thursday, like, you go to your coffee group, right? And then on Sunday you go to church twice, 2 times, 4 times a month. Adding stuff, more and more and more stuff. And underneath all the you shoulds and you betters, and if you love Jesus, you would, what starts happening is this message starts getting buried. And some of you are at this spot in your spiritual journey where you real honestly, and you don't say this out loud because you don't think you have permission to say this out loud, but God knows you say it anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. But like, you're at this honest place of like, what is the point? Like, I was initially compelled by this simple message, and yet you're at this place now where you can't even remember why you do what you do. You can't remember the last time you had a moving personal conversation with Jesus. You're at this place just overwhelmed, and you wonder, like, what's the point? And sometimes you even wonder if the only reason you're still around is because of your social network now is all Christians. I guess my hope, you guys, as we, not just this week, but the next few weeks, I guess my hope, I can make you this all but guarantee. We're probably not going to look at any verses that you're unfamiliar with. I'm probably not going to make any observations that you're not familiar with. But my hope in this series is that for those of you that it's just buried, it's just lost. Like, you don't even remember anymore the simple beauty of the gospel and what provoked you and compelled you to follow him. My hope is that you would re-find that. And not in an intellectual way, not in a theological way, but like in a heart way, like in an honest, like passionate, intimate, personal heart way. For some of you, it is really simple right now. And maybe that's part of what's been very life-giving about being a part of this network. I mean, that's part of the irony of all this. For some of us, being a part of Narrate maybe has added to the complexity, and Jesus is buried in there. And for others, what God has done in you is He simplified the message. And maybe there was other times in your life where it was simple, but you've rediscovered the simplicity of Jesus and His call. And there's part of you that wonders, okay, so when does the cycle happen again? When do I lose it again? Others of you maybe have started following Jesus for the first time in your life recently. And if you're there, I've been there, many of us have been there. What happens is you get an air of arrogance. You look at other Christians who, like Jesus is something they do, but not all that they do. You look at other Christians and you can see that He's buried. And it bugs you, and you probably say judgmental things. Many of us have been there, and we said really stupid things to people we loved, who did love Jesus, but like not fresh like us. And if you're there, you can't imagine it getting there. You can't imagine the monotony and it getting just buried in all the yuck. But those of us who have experienced it, we will say very confidently, it'll happen. Or at least it's all but inevitable unless you do something about it. And again, we're not going to look at verses that you've never heard before. We're not going to talk about ideas that you've never heard before. But I guess what we want to do is just go like, okay, Jesus, how do we keep it this way? Like, how do I protect this? How do I move forward in this way? Some of you are at this stage in your journey where you're just checking Jesus out. And quite frankly, it's the gross complexity, the mess, the buriedness that makes Jesus confusing to you. Because you've been to churches before and you understand they're all different, and you understand the stand up, sit down, sing, like, right, fight. And it's just like, blah, 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 you don't understand what's going on. And the fact of the matter is, what's even all the more confusing is you come to this church and we'll tell you who Jesus is, and you go to another one and they'll tell you who He is, and oftentimes churches don't even necessarily agree on that. And so your own spiritual journey is affected by this. So I'm excited to kind of go like, I think this is Jesus' creed. I think this is what He cares about. I think this is how He defines the win. This is what constitutes victory for Him. And then there's this. Perhaps you can relate to some of that. Perhaps you can relate to this. I know I can, and I'm constantly wrestling with the tension of enjoying and being grateful for what God is doing, and yet dreading the foreseeable monotony that comes with planting a church. Because perhaps you've been there before. You've been a part of a new, edgy, raw community before. And you understand that there's a natural cycle to that, and eventually, our conversations about firewood and giving the working poor Christmas trees, about hosting the art walk, about helping the downtown association put up decorations, will move from that to mortgage payments and giving and like, what color should the carpet be, right? Like, you see that. And quite honestly, I've never understood why when I was at Harvest, I never understood why Vern loved annual conference, which is our denominational yearly meetings. I never understood why he loved it so much. But I attended really for the second time, but really the first time as a lead pastor this last time, and I get it now. Because what stood out really vividly to me was this place of edgy relevance. We're having fun. We're not having these dumb conversations. The beauty of the gospel is not buried. It moves away from this rather rapidly. And to assume that it'll just stay here, left to its own devices, is foolish. And again, I think in the Jesus Creed, we can have some honest conversation about maybe how we can keep it there. So it moves into this question. Did Jesus have a creed? Because if you're at all a student of Jesus, you understand that one of the frustrating things about the Gospels, which are our biographies essentially, not the best word there, but closest thing we have to understanding Him, these four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, one of the things you understand if you're a student of Jesus is that He has a remarkable ability to be unclear. I mean, He says these beautiful things, He does beautiful things, but He doesn't ever give us the sinner's prayer. Shocking though that is. I mean, if you were to ask Jesus, line out for us the 5 most important things about being the church, He doesn't ever really give them in those terms. He's not a very systematic dude. So does He have a creed? Did He ever bury it, or did He ever boil it down to that simple place? And as Chad pointed out in the news a a few weeks ago. Obviously, we wouldn't have a series called What Was Jesus' Creed if you didn't have one. But I think to appreciate the creed, because I know for myself, I was first introduced to this idea by a guy named Scott McKnight, who's a national theologian, and I'd read the verses that he points to 1 billion times in my life, probably not 1 billion, but a lot, and I never understood it to be a Jesus Creed, and I think it's because I didn't understand the context in which Jesus lived. Now, this might shock you, but Jesus was Jewish, which means he probably had a crooked nose. He probably was short, curly hair, gnarly beard. He probably would go through intense screening at the airport in these days, right? Jesus was Jewish. It means he was circumcised on the 8th day, and he didn't have one of those lollipop things, if you've ever seen that. It means that he didn't, I thought of this week. I mean, he's God. He creates it all, and he lived his whole human existence and never got to taste lobster. Isn't that crazy? Like almost unjust, that like God never ate seafood because he was Jewish. And what I'm trying to point out is he was Jewish. He didn't just play the game. He was a Jewish man, which means like all Jewish men, when he woke up in the morning, almost first thing, he did the same thing that all Jewish people even today do. He recited the Jewish creed, what is often called the Shema. And the Shema, just like everything with people and spirituality, there's different variations, but it all centers on Deuteronomy 6. It starts in verse 4. You've heard this before. I was on an airplane the first time I went to Israel, and we're on an airplane. We're a few hours from Tel Aviv. You lose complete sense of time and what's going on, and this dude pops up, clearly a Orthodox dude. He pops up, he starts tying the I can't say the word, but you know what I'm talking about, right? I think there's, those things. Ties those around his arm, ties it around his head, and he starts rocking. And there's no doubt in my mind, I couldn't understand him, but that he was saying Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. Some of you are going, wait a minute, like plagiarism, like Jesus said this. No, we'll get to that. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk around the road, when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. I think it's a Bible bullet for tattoos, particularly the ones that have a verse reference. So, students, there's some leverage for you in your conversation with your parents. Tell them that Lenny sent you. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. This, and you've heard this. This is the Jewish creed. Every morning, every evening, for thousands of years, today. The Muslims get all the press for daily recited stuff. The Jews do this every morning and every evening. It epitomizes everything that's important to the Jewish people. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Love God with everything you've got. Which, you know what part of that means? It means that the tension we all feel, like to love God on Sunday and be a different person on Monday, it's not a cultural phenomenon. It's not even that you're more evil than other people. Like, people have wrestled with this for thousands of years because what they're trying to do is center themselves on life is about loving God. And second is then we love God by loving the Torah, the Jewish creed. I think Jesus did it every morning and every evening. And I don't think he quit when he put his Messiah hat on. I think Jesus did this every morning and every evening. In fact, one day, a scribe came up to Jesus and said, "Hey, what's the most important commandment?" And it's important to know that wouldn't have been a new phenomenon. Like, that would have been common to their culture. There's one rather famous story, I think we've even talked about it before, where a rabbi was approached by a goy, which is a Gentile, Greek for Gentile, and this goy said, "Okay, Rabbi, summarize it for me. What matters? What's it mean to be a Jew? And do it while standing on one foot." Which is his way of saying, like, don't get long-winded on me. I don't want a sermon. Like, give me a sentence. Keep it simple, stupid. So this wouldn't have been offensive to Jesus, nor would it have been uncommon. And Jesus, we get this interaction in Matthew. In Matthew 22, Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." What's he doing? He's affirming the Jewish creed. Like, what's important to me is what's important to you. And then he says, I wanted to do it while standing on one foot, but I was afraid you'd be confused, thinking that I thought I was a flamingo. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. The Jewish creed, so here it is. The Jewish creed is a love God creed. The Jesus creed, as Scott McKnight calls it, is a love God, love others creed. You ask Jesus, or you ask the Jews, what does it look like to be spiritually formed? What does it look like to be spiritually healthy? What does it look like to be in right relationship with God? They would say that you're loving God with everything. Jesus takes this sacred, historic Jewish creed and he adds to it from Leviticus 19:18, and love your neighbor as yourself, which means that you can begin to understand what got him killed, right? Because he's taking these sacred ideas and he's going, no. That the Jewish creed is love God. The Jesus creed, in other words, like if you're really connected with God, is that you'll love him and others, and not like those who you like. I mean, Jesus even took it another step up and went like, it's your enemies, like the people you don't like. Now, told you there was nothing new. If you fell asleep, like you already know what I said, so no worries. You don't need the podcast. Like, no new ideas, no new concepts. It's the tension that I want to point out. It's the fact that we start adding stuff, like giant blue balls. What is that? We start adding stuff, right? And the stuff, we start thinking this stuff is sacred. Like we start thinking that there's something holy about reading your Bible. That God is somehow pleased with you if you pray. Jesus goes, no. That's not what spiritual disciplines are about. It's a means to an end. God, when you read your Bible in the morning, that doesn't mean that you've just expressed to God you love him. So much as the assumption is that helps you, when you leave your house, actually love him by loving people. The tension here isn't new information. The tension is we add all this stuff, and a couple things can happen. We can feel really good about our spirituality and totally be missing on what Jesus says the goal is. The other is we just completely lose the value and the purpose and the point of following Jesus. The stuff only has value so long as it drives us to loving God and loving people. I heard a story this week about a guy named Mr. Abbott and Miss Sims. Mr. Abbott, in the early 90s, his wife died, and she was particularly passionate about the homeless poor. And so to honor her name, he started an organization in South Florida in a particular county that was designed to love homeless people. He named the thing Love Thy Neighbor. Simultaneously, a woman in the Northeast had already started a business, a jewelry business, called Love Your Neighbor. And she caught wind about this dude, Mr. Abbott in Florida. I don't understand how she knew about him. Maybe it was because only people in Florida buy her jewelry, not sure. She caught wind that he was doing business under the name Love Thy Neighbor, and the problem was she'd already trademarked that statement. And so a gal who owned a jewelry company called Love Your Neighbor sued and won a case that literally stated to the guy, you can't do business under the statement, love thy neighbor. Isn't that like honestly ironic? Isn't that exactly what every one of us deals with every day? Like we can rally under the Jesus creed. That's really not the issue. It's how do we do this? How do we live this out? Some of you, it's so buried. Jesus is so lost. I guess I'm hoping that November of 2010 is the season where you unbury him, unshovel him. Some of you, it's so simple for you right now, and you're going, yeah, you needed 7 words. I need a few. History will tell us that it won't stay there. And if you don't trust me, just engage somebody in the room who's followed Jesus for longer than a few years. It won't stay there unless you're intentional. Churches, it's pretty apparent at this point that we're not going to be 500 people by 2011. But I don't know about you. I just want it to stay raw and fruitful and progress. I understand that one of the most difficult things for a community of Jesus followers to do is over the course of a few decades, keep it on loving God and loving people. It's not amazing when a church plants and has 200 people or 1,000 people or 5,000 people a year later. There's plenty. Here, Chase. Since you like the blue ball so much, you can have it. Churches that plant and have 10,000 people a year later, there's plenty of examples. You know what's not common? Is churches that over the course of decades grow and stay raw and edgy and fruitful and hand it over to another generation and say, hey, mess with it, change it, keep it about Jesus, but move it forward. The question becomes, how do we do this? And here I do have what I think might be some new ideas. I wonder, how old was Jesus when he stopped reciting the Jewish creed and started reciting the Jesus creed? I just wonder, and I don't know that there's any way of knowing, at what point in Jesus' life did he can the Jewish creed and start reciting the Jesus creed? Because I'm convinced that right up to his death, he'd said the creed morning and evening. But when did he switch it? When did he add and love your neighbor as yourself? And what would happen if you as an individual did something that's very non-Western and actually got a little ritualistic in your relationship with God? And what would happen if you made a point to get up 2 minutes earlier, to stay in your car 30 seconds longer before you walk to the office? What would happen to you if you literally made a habit of starting your day reciting the Jesus Creed? And I don't even mean in your head, I mean out loud. What would happen to the centering? Because here's the deal. You can't guarantee yourself that it won't look like that in 5 years. You can't even guarantee yourself that it won't look like that in 2 years or 2 days. Jesus talks a lot about we have control over today. What would happen if every day you just centered yourself on, okay, God, here's what it's all about. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then what would happen if simultaneously or at the end of the day, you said it again, just like Jesus would have? And at the end of the day, it's not so much about centering as it is about accountability and just kind of auditing the day. Paying attention to, okay, did I define the day by how much money I made? Did I define the day by how many looks I got? Did I define the day by what my grade was? Did I define the day by what my checking account's balance was? Or did I define the day by loving God and loving people? What would happen if you personally, literally started and ended your day with the Jesus Creed? And then I wonder what would happen to a community of people who did something kind of ancient modern and went, yeah, we don't have many rhythms. We don't talk much about these things that we all do. But what would happen to the psyche and the fruit of a community who started and ended their day this way? Knowing that we can't control what kind of church we are in December, but we can control what kind of church we are on November 15th by centering ourselves and paying attention to that. What would happen? Let me pray. God, simplicity is both remarkable and beautiful and challenging because it's so difficult to keep it there, God. And on behalf of those of us who, there was a day where we couldn't believe that you wanted to use us. We couldn't believe that you loved us and had purposes and plans for our lives. We couldn't believe that despite everything we had done, you treasured us. There was a day, God, when it was remarkably simple. God, I pray that in this season, as we explore some new patterns and some new rhythms and some new habits, that you'd help us ingrain in our hearts and in our psyches and in our lives that the win for you is quite clear. It's about loving you and loving people, and that happens in a lot of ways. God, I pray for people who don't know you. They know a lot about you. They contemplate you. They wonder about you. They toy with you, perhaps. They shake their fist at you. God, I'm sorry for the role that I've played, and we're sorry for the role we've played in convoluting that message. I pray that in this season you would boil it down for them and keep it simple. Thank you, God, for the Jesus Creed. Would you help it shape and form who we are and the way we live?